So we start then by talking about what we mean by anxiety. And I'm sure you're all aware that anxiety is a mental health condition, and a really serious and debilitating one at the end of the extreme. And part of the purpose of this evening's webinar is to help you know when your child's natural and general anxiety might be turning into something much more serious that actually needs some intervention. All of us experience anxiety in our everyday life, and it's actually a very healthy and normal emotion. But as I'm sure you know, sometimes that emotion can take over, and it can actually cause us to not be able to cope with just the ordinary things of everyday life. And the statistics are quite horrifying, really, for teenage girls in particular, and the levels of anxiety that they are experiencing. So hand over to Kate, really, for the causes of anxiety, are the main ones that we see in school.
Okay, so adolescence and teenage years are a time of huge emotional, physical and social change. The teenage brain is going through a huge amount of change, and it's a really, really intense time. The word anxiety is quite often quite overused by our teenagers, and they can say, I'm feeling really anxious, I've had an anxiety attack. It's really important to kind of pull that back and think, actually, are you really anxious, or are you just a little bit frightened, or are you just a little bit nervous? They've experiencing new things, and it's really hard for them to gauge just how nervous or frightened they are of these things. They want to have new experiences. They want to have more independence. You have to figure out how much of that you allow them to have. The sort of rule of thumb is you give them as much freedom as you think they can cope with and that you can cope with. And it's fine to have a few rules and regulations in place and certain time to be home and tell me who you're with and keep in touch. Their friendships move about all over the place. Some friends are off doing all sorts of different things in this time, some things they can't cope with. All of them seem to be bugged by social media, that, unachievable level of beauty and perfection that they seem to think they have to achieve. There's a lot of life goes on social media. A lot of times they're on their own in their bedroom. It's just them and that screen, and it's very difficult for parents to interject in that and to interfere. And that's a really difficult position for parents to be in. They have a whole life that they basically don't know about. Academic pressure is something that we seem to be seeing is more self-inflicted by the teenagers than inflicted by their parents at the moment. It's also the time where romantic relationships are starting to kick in. They're starting to feel exposed, open themselves up to rejection. They might really like somebody, it's not reciprocated, and all of that is so difficult for them to manage, and it feels like their whole world at the time
is causing anxiety.
Yeah.
Right. So the big question then is, what do we mean by normal anxiety? It is a natural response of your body and your brain to danger. So it's actually an extremely useful emotion to have. And what we find is that young people can fall into two kind of categories. And you might have two types of teenager in your family right now. The laid back teenager, nothing seems to bother them. And in actual fact, you want them to have a little bit more anxiety, especially when it comes to revising. But you could just as easily have a very sensitive child in your family. And this is the child that's much more prone to get anxious about the smallest everyday thing. And that child is going to need quite a lot more support in managing this normal anxious response to everyday stressors. And let's not forget that once that anxiety is channeled and managed properly, it's extremely helpful emotion. We find that some of the more sensitive and anxious students are incredibly empathetic. They can spot when other people aren't coping well. They can spot when their friends need more support. They're very, very caring. It can also make them excellent leaders, because the anxiety means that they have attention to detail. They're wondering about what could go wrong and how can I manage my event or my exam to ensure that that doesn't happen. They can also simply be quite good at managing exams, in that they will actually prepare properly and carefully. So it can be a great motivator for them. The question is, when does that anxiety actually become counterproductive? It can be a useful, normal emotion, but when is it counterproductive? If your child has a tendency to be very sensitive and anxious. A temptation as a parent can be to try and smooth the way forward, get rid of anything that stresses them out, whether it be not being selected for the netball team, or a friendship difficulty, or issues over whether they've been invited to a party or not. But actually, that's not the right approach. Your sensitive child needs these stressful situations so that with your help and support, they can learn to manage and negotiate them. Because in life later on down in the path, they're going to experience some really tough, real stressful situations. So it's almost as if they're practicing in school for these big life stressors. And the anxious child, more than anyone, needs to experience the stressful situations in order to learn how to cope with them. So what about when it becomes a problem, Kate?
So as Heather says, it's known as being the lighthouse parent rather than being the helicopter parent. The lighthouse parent is there, they can always see you, they know where you are, but you're not moving, you're just this constant presence. And we all know what a helicopter parent does. However, it can cause problems. And when it causes lack of sleep, and for them to not be able to get the full amount of sleep in order to function properly, it really can mess with their head, and it's a really unpleasant place for them to be in, and it can go downhill really quite rapidly. If you notice your teenager starting to avoid situations that you can't really understand why they're avoiding, occasions with friends, family occasions, something that they would normally be able to do quite happily, that they are actively trying to get out of, that's a red flag. That's something to try and explore with them. If they don't want to come to school, and they will give you some very defensive, very snappy reasons why they don't want to go to school, and it's like a fait accompli, I'm not going to school, that's another red flag. It's quite often nothing to do with actual school. It's just a pile-on of all of their issues and aggressors and problems that they are just can't do anything, and they just want to stay at home.
And I think it's fair to say that quite a lot of children don't want to come to school and are pretty grumpy about coming, especially if they've had a difficult weekend or they're tired. But when anxiety is becoming a problem is when you're getting the meltdowns before school, when it's actually starting to impact on their attendance. A child who is of normal health should really be attending at least 96% of the time. If you're finding that your young person is off sick or feeling ill once a week and not going into school, that is your red flag. That's when the anxiety is actually becoming a problem. And if you don't intervene and address it with some professional help, you could end up with a full school phobia going on, and that's really quite tough to fix.
So, sometimes it can lead to the teenager taking matters into their own hands, and quite often without the parents' knowledge. So they could be cutting themselves, exercising a bit of self-harm, restricting their calories. It's just a way of trying to regain some control. It's trying to actually affect some change that they can see they're in control of in their lives. Equally, the OCD type behaviour, the ritualistic behaviours where they have to do certain things a certain amount of time or have their food arranged a certain way on the plate. This is again an attempt to regain control. If you notice any strange behaviour like this, it's again something to take notice of and something to let us know that you've noticed.
And sometimes parents can become quite fixated on the behaviour is the problem. The self-harm needs to be sorted out. The self-harm is a massive issue. And it is super scary and horrible if you've experienced that. But remember that these are the coping mechanisms that your child is trying out in order to cope with the underlying anxiety. So it's important not to sort of focus on these outward manifestations of the anxiety and start to work with the child on coping with their anxiety in a much more healthy way than these kinds of coping mechanisms are.
At the bottom of the slide, you can see we've got the resource of youngminds.org.uk. It's a fantastic website, and it literally is a one-stop shop for resources and other links and other websites that you can be led to get pretty much all the help you might need with your child.
Okay, so if we go, I'm going to move on then. Home life and school life. One of the things that's absolutely fascinating about anxiety is how it can present differently at home and at school. So it isn't unusual for a parent to ring up and say, my child is really having meltdowns, doesn't want to come to school, I'm really worried about them, they're telling me that school is dreadful and that they're totally stressed, really concerned. And for the school to say, well, they're absolutely fine with us, they seem really happy, no problem at all. And likewise, it wouldn't be unusual for a school to phone a parent and say, your child isn't coping, they're coming out of lessons in tears, they're having meltdowns in lessons, we're having to drag them out of the toilets, etc. And the parent to say, what are you talking about? They tell me that everything's fine, 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 and they're up in the bedroom. What on earth is going on here? Well, the truth is that what often happens with children suffering from anxiety is a behaviour we call masking. In other words, they are coping until suddenly they become overwhelmed and they can't manage anymore. And the driver for this is really something we call the shame barrier. So in other words, to fall apart at school would be horribly embarrassing. They want to present an image at school that they can cope with everything, that they're in control, that they're excellent students. And it's at home then that they can't keep that up and they're absolutely shattered or exhausted. And it's just as usual to find it the opposite way round. They don't want to let you down as the parent. They don't want to be seen as less than the perfect student at home. And so they mask at home, and it's at school where they're letting out their emotions and feelings, perhaps because they feel that they can offload on their friends, but they can't offload at home. At home, maybe their parents are struggling with their own worries and they feel like they're going to tip their parents over the edge. And so they mask at home, and then we see these blow-ups at school. However it manifests itself, the only really effective way to deal with this is by a three-way communication process. The child, the school, and the parent working together. If you try to just fix it at home within your family, it isn't going to be anywhere near as effective as if you work with your child's school. And likewise, if we're seeing these issues at school, we're going to need your help as a parent. And so I really want to emphasise the importance of you reaching out to your child's school.
Okay, so what can parents do? If your child will readily talk to you about their issues, then you're really, really lucky. Oftentimes they will just clam up because quite often they don't really know what's wrong either. They just know they don't feel right. They know that their head is a complete mash. Everything's going 90 miles an hour. Should they tell you what's wrong, it's really important that you validate their feelings. Don't be patronising, but just go, okay, that's fine. If you've got that horrific situation where you've realised your child has self-harmed, every ounce of your being wants to ask them a million questions and ask why and, probably cry, but try and hold it together and go, okay, let's have a look. Let's just make sure it's safe. Let's make sure it's not infected. Let's talk about it. Is there something you want to talk to me about? Gradually, you start to gain their trust. And when they do start to offload, you just listen. You don't try and fix it. You just listen. Again, you'll be so tempted to try and find something to fix it or find someone else that can come and fix it for them. Trust yourself. Your instincts are always right with your child. It's just giving yourself the space to actually hear them and listen to them. And that is only by being calm and slowing everything down.
I think it's important to say that quite often actually dealing with the anxiety is really allowing and enabling your child to get it out, to actually offload what's upsetting them. And I can tell you now that if they do start to offload onto you as the parent, that will be incredibly helpful to them because it will enable them to process what they're saying. And actually, as you as the parent, your job really is just to soak up that angst. And to be completely calm and invest the time that it takes into that child. And believe you me, when they offload, it will be at the most inconvenient time. It'll be at 11:30 at night when you've got to be up at 6 a.m. for an important work call. It's never going to be at the time that you select when you think, right, I've got half an hour now between dinner and my favourite programme, the Bake Off, so let's sit down and talk about your problems. Be prepared for this moment of offloading to come at just the wrong moment. And it might also sound incredibly selfish. It might sound quite pathetic. It might sound ridiculous what they're telling you. And part of you is thinking, for goodness sakes, there's a war on in Ukraine. Let's get some perspective. Try to resist the temptation to be judgmental, because the child wants to be simply heard and validated. And for them, this is their whole experience and their whole world. Quite often they test you out, don't they?
Yes.
They say something small to judge how you're going to react. It's like they're testing you. And it could be something quite pathetic. So if you go, for goodness sake, get over yourself, they'll think, I can't talk to my parent then. I'll have to go online, or I'll have to just rely on my friends.
They will equally try and test how far they can actually push you. When they've started to tell you something, they're a bit like, well, they reacted okay to that, but wait till I tell them this, and then this. And the whole way to deal with it is just not to be shocked by anything. We're asking an awful lot of you. We both know how difficult it is. We've both been there. And it's so important that as parents, you have somewhere else that you can go and talk to your mates, go and confide in your friends, because they will have all been through very similar things. And because with your child, you have to just be this absorbent sponge, which is nothing anyone ever taught us how to do when, 1 minute you were dating and now you've got this teenager. And but one technique that if they won't open up, if you're really struggling to get anything you can actually go on, anything you can really bite on to know what's going on that's wrong with them, is to get a load of cushions, any cushions that you can find around your house, and get them to hold their hand out and put one cushion on their arms and say, right, what is the biggest problem? What's the biggest issue that you're holding right now? And it could be exams. Okay, get another cushion, put it on there. What's the next one? It could be friendships. Get another one. Could be how they feel about themselves. I don't feel pretty enough. I don't feel thin enough. I don't feel good enough. And you keep putting them on and asking them what these issues are. The really prominent visual symbol in this is that they stop being able to actually see you, and they stop being able to see themselves. And that is quite an important and powerful message, that I can't see myself anymore, and I can't see you, and I've completely lost sight of myself and the fact I've got you there to help me. Then you name these cushions and you figure out what you need to do with each of them. So, and some will be more important than others, and it's really important to prioritise which one has to be dealt with first. Some of the cushions can be duffed up and chucked in the corner because they're not worth worrying about. Some need to have some action taken over them. And this can be a really powerful tool to use with your teen to actually start the conversation.
We'll talk a little bit more about conversations, I think, and how to have them, because we have had a few questions from parents struggling to talk to their teens. I do want to mention again sleep. Please keep a close eye on how well your teen is sleeping. Students with anxiety disorders really struggle with sleep, and it's the first thing that needs to be addressed. So watch what's happening and make sure, for goodness sakes, that all the devices are out of the child's bedroom at night and being charged up somewhere else at home.
I'd like to say a little something about academic pressure. We do have perfectionist teenagers, boys and girls, and it's so important that they understand they do not have to have everything figured out. Sometimes as adults, we feel like we've got to have everything figured out, but that sort of attitude is getting younger and younger, and we have teenagers that feel that they've got to have everything figured out. Their looks, their social life, their academic success, and if anything fails, they then suddenly are a failure themselves, and that's not the case. Life is a progression, not an exercise in perfection, and one bad score doesn't matter. It's not going to unravel the rest of your life, and it's not going to unravel the rest of your academics. And making them very, very aware of this is really important, because it might be something you don't see at home. It's something we really see at school, this need to have everything figured out. They don't. They can abandon that worry completely, because that's what being a teenager is all about, is learning, and that's what the school is there for, is to teach them this stuff. Yeah. And if they don't do very well, the school will help them get back on the right track.
So just a couple of other practical things. It's obvious really, but make sure there's lots of things for your anxious and sensitive child to look forward to. It doesn't have to be huge, big things. It could just be going for a coffee. It could just simply be a nice day out. Lots of little goals to look forward to and to distract the mind. And finally, any of these red flags, reach out. You can go to your GP and you can go to your school. So schools are really important. I've mentioned it before, and I think it's useful for you to understand actually what schools are able to do. So firstly, all schools will have a special educational needs department that will be geared up to support students with anxiety. It's not just for dyslexic students, for example, and they will have specialists there who can work with your child to address and understand what's causing their anxiety, specifically if it's related to their learning, and particularly if your child is neurodiverse, and we know there is a link between neurodiversity and anxiety. They might go through some breathing exercises with them, a timeout card, or like our school, they may well have a wellbeing room, which is a safe space for students to go to when they really need someone to support them. If the anxiety is related to exams, there are a lot of adjustments that can be made to public exams and class tests that can support the anxious student. And that's really important, that the school is aware that your child struggles with exam anxiety, so that those arrangements can be put in place well before the real exams actually start. And if you come to a situation where your child is falling apart and it's totally unexpected within exam season, pick up the phone, speak to your exams officers, because there are things that can be done. So for you as the parent, remember that this might be the first time you've had experience of a young anxious student, but for your school it will be the 500th time they've dealt with this situation. And so make use of that brilliant resource and that brilliant experience.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so our top tips: never underestimate your ability to manage your child's anxiety. At the end of the day, you are really all they want. You might have a need to call on the services of other professionals, but in that lag between figuring out that your child is suffering from anxiety and getting that professional help, you are enough. You're enough to get them over this hump. And then when the professional help kicks in, you are the one with them all the time. That could only be once a week. Don't fear, have trust in your relationship with your child, because you do know them better than anybody. All of us think, I've never had to deal with this before. I've never been trained in any of this, but it's just use your instincts, slow your whole self down, and then they will slow down. They will pick up on your cues.
And I was going to say, back to the underreaction and the overreaction. Yeah. So when you're able to encourage your child to start off loading on you, which is the first step to getting this anxiety out and off them, don't underreact by minimising it and telling them off for being silly or being selfish, and not thinking about the fact that you've got an incredibly stressful job. And don't overreact by rushing off to try and fix it and ringing up the parent that's upset your child and having a go at them. All of that will make your child retreat back into themselves. Your job is simply to listen and actually to validate their feelings, which is what you can see, some good phrases on the screen. And a really good tip is actually to take your child out of the house for maybe a dog walk or maybe a car journey, so that you're not eyeballing them. And I wonder, Kate, if you could tell them about your friend and the car journey, because that was amazing.
Yeah, anytime you're side by side. Well, a friend of mine told me this technique that she used with her son, and she called it the sweep. And she suspected he was up to some naughty behaviour. And she got him in the car and said, we're going to the garden centre. And they were driving along a fairly remote road, and they're chatting away calmly and happily, nothing at all to worry about. And she swooped into a lay-by and she turned around to me and she went, right, tell me what you've been up to. And he just spilled out everything. She knew, but she needed him to tell her. She needed to open the conversation, and it worked beautifully. Now, if you don't have a car you can go out in, so long as you're side by side, that's the main thing. If you're walking along, if you're going for a run, if you're going for a cycle ride, if you're side by side and not looking at each other directly, it's so much easier for them to open up.
And don't be frightened to actually address it directly, to say, I know something's not right. You know I'm here and I'm ready to listen. And even if your child goes, I'm fine, and refuses to talk at that moment, you've let them know that you are there and you're available.
Yeah.
And it won't be long, I wouldn't suspect, until they actually do come to you. at 11:30 at night, to actually start the conversation in their own time and when they're ready. And that is all that really is required of you. And you can make such an impact on your child's well-being by being that kind of parent. And don't underestimate the investment of time this is going to be if you have a sensitive child. It is going to be a lot of listening to angsty conversations, absorbing the anxiety, but you will come through the other side and you will have a wonderful daughter who is empathetic, a great leader, thinks about other people and spots all the issues. And I can promise you that is up ahead, but it will be sometimes quite painful for you to get to that point.
It can be a bit of a long road, but when your teenager has opened up, you feel so relieved that they've opened up to you and that you've got this information about them that they were worrying about. The temptation is to keep revisiting it and going back in and going, how is that thing? How are you feeling about that? Quite often, the fact they've offloaded it onto you, quite often at 11:30 at night, because they don't want another sleepless night, it's gone for them. They're actually, oh, phew, I'm releasing myself of that. They won't tell you that. They'll just go off thinking, brilliant, you're still stressing about it. Check back in with them, but don't keep bringing that same situation up. If you notice their behaviour is still a bit strange, say, look, is there something else bothering you? And they know they can trust you to bring it up because you're not going to massively overreact. Now, we're going again from experience of massively overreacting. And seeing this and having the privilege of working with lots of parents in school. When they do talk to you, just allow them to vent and validate, even if you don't always 100% get it. So that doesn't sound good. That sounds really difficult. I can see that would upset you. That would upset me too. That sounds really hard. I know you can do it. Look, you did that other thing. You solved that. You own that situation. You can own this one.
Yeah. And I think the key is empowering them to be able to think that they can manage this themselves. If you fix it for them, you are actually disempowering them and making them more anxious, less confident in their ability to sort things out for themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And quite often the temptation is to figure out the whole scenario and go, what do they say? And what do they think about that? And how do they feel? And did you upset them? And try not to do that until you've allowed them, till they've got your trust and they think you're really hearing them. Then you can possibly explore the actual other details of the situation. But initially, they are really testing you to know that you're not going to dishonour what they're saying or question what they're saying or question their feelings about it, most importantly.
So I think we need to move on to the Q&As now,
don't
we, Kate? And we did have some questions before this particular webinar, and one of them was about the child who doesn't want to go to school in the morning. And as I mentioned, this is quite worrying. And once you've tried all your usual techniques, come on, you've got to go to school, it's the law, etc., and your child is really starting to dig their heels in, then you're looking at perhaps something which is going to need a little bit more professional support than you can offer, and that's when you can go to your school. I'm going to suggest that it's going to take a commitment of time. So you might need to arrange to go into work later for a week and just give your child that time in the morning to vent, to explore their feelings. And again, as Kate said, slowing down the morning routine can help, rather than, come on, you are going to school or aren't you going to school? I've got to get in the car and start my journey. It is going to take time and effort. But like I say, if that is starting to become a pattern that's affecting your child's attendance, then you definitely need to have a conversation with the school to explore perhaps there's some learning issues behind that.
Definitely. They quite often promise to go in the next morning. If you just let me stay home today, I'll go in the next morning. They won't want to, but we'll take that because we've got to get to work. If you can talk to your work and go in an hour later or 2 hours later or have the morning off even, your child knows you're really taking it seriously and that they're actually more important than anything else. And that can be a really powerful message. And it's disrupting the normal pattern of things. And that is a really good arena for them to open up.
Yeah. So I think our central message really is, if you have a child that's very sensitive, they can come through this. And the teenage years are the years in which they're going to learn how to manage these experiences. And your job is simply to listen, to reassure and to validate them, and they will come through it. So I think that's all from us, and
Yes.
thank you very much for listening to our webinar. I hope you found it useful.